During this video module, we'll talk about three basic concepts that we will use throughout the entire course. The first is the notion of a directory and the underlying directory structure that the operating system provides. The second is the notion of a file, and a file is a unit of information or a set of information that's stored at a particular location. And finally, we'll talk about the command prompt that is an interface to the operating system, in this case the Windows operating system. We'll also mention a couple of things related to these topics about Linux and about OS X, but our primary focus will be on the use of Windows. So first of all, we have these three related topics: the notion of a drive or a disk drive, which is a physical or logical device where we store files. Examples, again, in Windows are the C drive and the H drive. And so we can see these if you go to the Windows Explorer, which hopefully everybody's familiar with, and we can see the C drive here and the H drive here. And these are by convention, the C drive is called the C drive because initially computers had two removable disks or floppy disks. The first one was A, the second one was B, and when they added the notion of an internal or hard drive, naturally it became the C drive, and so that's what you see today. In a lot of institutions like Auburn, for example, the H drive stands for your home directory. So this is the home, the place where you keep files. And so again, typically called the H drive to represent a home drive. Also note that on this computer in particular, the C drive is a physical drive. You can see the little icon here. My H drive is a network drive, so I'm actually connected to the Auburn network, and so this is a logical drive that's actually physically stored on a different computer. And it's this notion of a logical drive that allows you to see the same directory regardless of what computer you log into. For example, on campus, if you go to any lab computer and log in, your H drive will look the same. That's because the H drive is actually stored somewhere else and you're just making that logical connection on your local computer. So we have this notion of a disk drive, which is an important concept. In OS X and in Linux, they have abstracted this, and so you don't typically deal with an actual physical or logical drive, but you just deal with directories or folders, and the operating system itself does that mapping between a physical drive or a logical drive and the directory, which we will talk about next. A directory, sometimes also referred to as a folder, is a location in this hierarchical structure that we use to organize file storage. And so we represent that. You can see this is what's called the root directory of the C drive. We have the temp directory of the H drive, and then I have the my user account on my C drive here. And so you can see if we go to Explorer, that let me see if I can get there, the directory structure that you see, if I go to C and say go to temp, for example, this is the, you can see it up here, this is the temp directory on the C drive. If I go to my H drive, for example, I can navigate from H, let's just go to courses, 3010, which would be this course, and you can see that I have several different subdirectories under that main directory. And so I have on my H drive, the courses directory, my 3010 directory, then I can go to the code directory, for example, and we see this hierarchical structure. And then so what we're actually seeing is something that looks like this. We have our H drive that we just saw, and then we can see that this is divided up into a number of directories. Each one of these directories can be further subdivided as so. And so we can see what we mean, or what I mean here in my notion of a hierarchical directory structure. So for example, this might be courses, this might be INSY 3010, code, etc. And so you can see the overall structure of the drive is set up in this hierarchical structure. Also note that, as I mentioned previously, in Linux or in OS X, you don't have this notion of a physical drive. Instead, that's abstracted away. And so we typically see this as, for example, home, and then we have the same hierarchical structure. We just don't have the physical drive. Instead, that is mapped by the operating system into a name, again, typically something like home. Interestingly, when you look at this hierarchical structure, people generally fall into one of two categories as to how they organize this. You have some people who are highly organized, and you see a very deep hierarchical structure. So in other words, you see lots of subdirectories, long paths into that drive, so you have multiple subdirectories. And so again, if you look, for example, at my directory here, when you go to my H drive, I have lots of different subdirectories, and then under the subdirectories I have lots of directories, and so on. The second group of people typically have a very shallow directory structure where they tend to store lots of things in the same place. So for example, if you go to the My Documents directory, they would have everything stored under there. And so it's not that either way is right or wrong. For our purposes, it's just understanding how to navigate around the file system and understanding how to find things within that directory structure. The next concept we're interested in is that of a file. And a file we can think of as an electronic document for storing information. So I have this document term in quotes because it's not always a document. What a file actually is it's a location in the directory structure where information is stored on the disk drive. And so, for example, if I go to my directory structure, here we are in my H drive, and let's just follow this from courses, our course 3010, go to my code directory, my directory examples, and let's go to D2. So here we are at H, courses, 3010, code, dir examples 2. So I have, again, this fairly deep structure that is organized, again, to my mind, in a logical fashion. Now within this directory, this D2 directory, we can see three separate files. We see file1.docx, file1.txt, and file1.xlsx. And hopefully you realize or you recognize these file names as a Microsoft Word document, a text document, and a Microsoft Excel document. All three of these are examples of files. So going back, let's see, what we want to explore is this notion of a file name before we talk more about files. And so you can see I've gone back to PowerPoint here, and I've switched to a different computer. And so this is this notion I mentioned earlier of a network drive. And so when we look here, we can see that my H drive on this particular computer that I was working on here is mapped to kudzu.eng.auburn.edu. And so this is the actual physical computer where my home drive exists. Whereas if I look on my current computer that I'm recording this video on, I have that same H drive, but it's mapped using a network application called WebDrive. But once I map that drive, I get the exact same structure regardless of which actual computer I'm working on. But we have the same directory that I just talked about, where we have the three files, file1.docx, file1.txt, and file1.xlsx. And what I want to talk about just a little bit is this notion of a file name. And so we can see how the text file, file1.txt, is represented, and this portion right here would be typically what we refer to as a file name. But also, some people refer to just file1, oops, get back to here, is also the file name or just the name, and the .txt is what's referred to as the extension. So in Windows, the extension is what typically defines the application that we use with the file. So I mentioned earlier that you probably recognize the docx file as a Word file, the text file, the txt file as a text file, and finally the xlsx file as a Microsoft Excel file. And so what Windows does is it relates files to applications, and it uses this extension. And so that's why we see the Word icon here, the Notepad icon here, and finally the Excel icon here. This other portion right here is what's called the path. the path to the file. That's pretty bad writing here. Let's see if I can do that a little bit better. Path. Sometimes called the directory path, and so that gives me the precise location of this file. So this is on my H drive in the courses directory, 3010 subdirectory, code subdirectory, and so on that we see the picture of over here in Explorer. If we take the entire component, which is the path and the file name together, this is sometimes called the fully qualified file name. Sorry about that. I don't know where that comes from. Fully qualified file name. So when you hear someone talk about the fully qualified file name, what that means is it's the path plus the file name. If you hear just the file name, it can be the name of the file, or it can be the name plus extension, and hopefully the context will let us decide which one it is. So at a high level, there are two basic types of files. There are text files and binary files. Again, this is kind of a high-level description where a text file is stored in human readable form. Again, a very high-level description, not technical at all. And a binary file is not. A binary file is not designed to sort of be read by humans. And hopefully this will make a little bit more sense as we move forward, looking at the command prompt and looking at some of the applications. But for our class in particular, it's important because all of the Python programs and the database programs that we'll work with will be done in text files, and so we need to understand this distinction a little bit between text files and binary files. If you look at our example, oops, that's not what I want. We look at our example here of file1.doc, file2, or file1.text, and file1.xls. If I go back and look at these applications, if I just double click, as you know in Windows, that the association based on this extension is going to pull up Word. So if we look at this file, what we see is a set of numbers, 123, 87, 96, etc. So let me just minimize this for a second. Go back and do the same thing under for the XLSX file. And what we see is the exact same set of numbers. So if I go, let me just put these side by side here, you can see that we have the exact same pieces of information, but these files are stored in two different formats. These are both binary files that are interpreted by the application. So Word is a program, and it reads the file and then it displays it in a way that it can interact with the user. In Excel, it reads its own file format, again a binary file, and displays that information in a way that you can use it. So in Excel, for example, we can use Excel functions. So I could get, oops, if I could spell, I can get the sum of our numbers like this, and so on. If I'm in Word, I can then write a paragraph. So, you know, this is a set of numbers, and so on. If we look at the text file, again, it's stored in human readable form. So in this case, when I double click on it, the association, the standard association for text files in Windows is with an application called Notepad. And at this point, these files again all look the same, but there's this fundamental difference at the operating system level that we're going to see in just a second after we talk a little bit about the command prompt. So up until now, our interaction with our computer has been primarily through the Windows Explorer. The command prompt, or in the case of Linux and OS X, it's called the terminal or the console, provides us something called command line access to the operating system and the file system. And so in Windows, I can open the command prompt a number of ways. I can just hit the Windows key and type CMD for example, and it will pull up the command prompt accordingly. I can also go through the apps tree. So I just click on the Windows, go to All Apps, and scroll down. And Windows stores the command prompt under let's see, where is it? Windows System. There we go, Windows System, and there's the command prompt. So you can see that, and I can open multiple copies. As I said, what the command prompt is it is a command line access, or it provides command line access to the operating system or file system. And so that's what we see right here when we talk about the command line. That's this little thing right here. And so what this tells me is that I am currently located in my C drive in the users in the JSMIT directory. So if I want to go back, I can use the CD command. And you can see I have listed here a number of commands that we'll use during the course. And it'll take you a little while to get used to these individual commands, but you can see if I do dir, that's short for directory, and it shows me what's on the drive. So I am right now located in the C drive in the root directory. So if I were to go back to my Explorer and just go to the same location, we can now put these side by side, and you can see that I have the exact same set of information. I have a directory called Apache 2.4, which is right here, a directory called Intel, which is right here, and so on. You can see also we have some sorting differences, and we have, in my Explorer case, a hidden directory that doesn't show up on the command line. So the command line, or the command prompt, as I said, we're going to use to interact with the operating system. And so you need to experiment with these different commands so that you can get used to navigating around the file system. So for example, if I wanted to get and look at these, I talked about the fundamental difference between binary and text files. If I wanted to get to that location where those files are, we know that's H courses INSY3010 code dir examples G2 file 1. I can get there in the command prompt by just switching from the C drive to the H drive using the CD or change directory command. So I'll go to courses CD INSY3010. At any point here I can do a directory and see what's there. There's the directory here, and I can also then go to my code, and I can do these in multiple steps, so I don't have to do CD one directory at a time. I can do CD code dir examples D2, for example, and that takes me all the way to the directory. This is a network drive, so I guess it's going to take a second for it to get there. Hopefully not too long. There we are. And then do a dir, and you can see the three files that we also can see, the same three files that we see in Explorer. And I mentioned before when we talked about file types that there was this fundamental difference, and we can illustrate that using the type command that we see right here. So type is the file, is the command to type the file. So if I do type file1.txt, we can see our list of numbers. And so when I said a text file is stored in human readable form, that's exactly what I meant, is that if you use the type command or other various commands, you can interact with the file directly. Whereas if I were to type the docx file, file1.docx, which is our Word file, we see basically a mishmash of not human readable form, and this would tell me again that what we're looking at is a binary file, and so it's not meant to be interacted with directly, at least from our perspective. And so this is why we interact with this type of file through Word. Same thing if we look at file1.xlsx, we get the same type of mishmash here that is not human readable because it's meant to be interacted with through this other program. So again, you should experiment with these different files, these different commands. As I mentioned, dir is to show me the directory, cd is to the change directory. If you want to create a new directory, use md. If you want to remove a directory, rd, and so on. You can copy files, you can delete files, and so on. And so there's an assignment here that lets you experiment with this. What's critical for our understanding, or for this course, is that we understand this hierarchical structure of the directory and that we be able to navigate through that. And so that's when we went to the H courses INSY3010 code dir examples G2 directory, being able to conceptualize what that hierarchical structure and then navigate to that structure, either using the Windows Explorer or by using the various command line the command line commands using the Windows command prompt. So in summary, in this video what we looked at was the notion of a disk or a drive and that hierarchical directory structure of storing information on the drive, and then the notion of a file or an electronic document for storing information. We talked about navigation around the hierarchical structure, and I emphasize again that the critical aspect here is that you understand this hierarchical structure and that you be able to visualize sort of where you are in that hierarchical structure, so that I can use either Windows Explorer to find files, or I can use the command prompt to navigate my way to those files. And so those two things are critical for our understanding of how to incorporate Python, developing programs, executing programs, packaging programs, and so on.